Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Facebook Live. First, let me take this opportunity to thank Amanda Friedemann from the museum for giving me the opportunity to share with you today my family's stories before, during, and after the Holocaust. As a second-generation speaker on behalf of the museum, I've had the privilege since 2016 to share these family stories with young people and adults throughout the Midwest, as well as in Germany. And the central theme around these stories is actually the title of my presentation today: The Dilemma of Jews in Germany in the 1930s, to Stay or to Go, and the Consequences of These Decisions. So you probably noted from the introductory material that my name is Ethan Bensinger. But wait, that's not my name. Whoops, this is not moving, excuse me here. There, that's not my name. My name is Eitan Benjamin. More about the last name Benjamin in just a moment, but let me tell you something about my first name, Eitan. Eitan is a Hebrew name. I was born in Israel to parents who left Germany in the 1930s for Palestine, which of course today is Israel. Now, some people have asked me, your parents left Germany? Didn't the Nazis kill all the German Jews? And of course, the answer to that is no. And that's the story that I'm going to tell you today. So one of the first points that I like to make when I'm giving this presentation to students is that the events of the 1930s and 40s didn't just culminate in the mass murder of 6 million Jews. Those events created a Jewish diaspora, the dispersion of Jews to the four corners of the world. As you can see from the slide with respect to German Jewish emigration, some who were able to get affidavits of support from close relatives in the United States came to America. Others were able to flee to South America. Some 17,000 were able to go to Shanghai, and others to the Middle East. In my case, my parents and grandparents went to Palestine. Now, whether to leave Germany or to stay was not necessarily an easy decision for people to reach. Yes, for my mother, who was young and a Zionist, it was an easier decision, but for her parents, who were older, well settled in Germany, it was far more difficult, but eventually they got out as well. And I was fortunate to be able to talk to my mother, my grandmother, and other relatives about their motivations to leave Germany. But I couldn't talk to the many relatives that were not able to leave and were swallowed up by the Nazi killing machine. And I'll share their stories today with you as well. Taking my immediate family's experience, I'd like to examine with you the factors, the four factors that individuals look at in determining whether to leave their country of birth or residence in times of crisis. And these are fear, vilification, in other words, being bullied, having names called, being humiliated. The third is necessity. And the last, in better times, economic opportunity. Let's start with factor number one, fear. And let me introduce you to my paternal grandparents, Ida and Herman Bensinger. My grandfather Herman was born in 1874 in the ancestral hometown of Bodersweier in southern Germany, a small farming village near the Rhine River and the border with France. I had the good fortune of traveling for the first time to Bodersweier in the 1970s, and doing some genealogical research at that time, learned that the first Bensingers came to Bodersweier at that time in the 1700s. So we've had a foothold in Germany for over 250 years. And in fact, in 1809, the Jews of Bodersweier, and actually the entire region of Baden, were told that if they had a Hebrew name, they had to change their name to a German last name. So Benjamin became Bensinger. Excuse me. My great-grandparents had 16 children, of which my grandfather Herman was one. My great-grandfather was a well-to-do cattle dealer, but my grandfather Herman didn't want to stay in the cattle dealing business. He wanted to move to the big city, Frankfurt, and that's what he did. And he married my grandmother Ida and started a textile business. In 1908, my father Ernest was born in Frankfurt. During World War I, my grandfather Herman fought with soldiers of all religions, Jewish, Protestant, Catholic. But could he have then imagined that some 20 years later, perhaps some of the soldiers with whom he fought would be exterminating Jews? After the war, the textile business flourished, with offices being opened in Berlin, London, Danzig. In 1929, my grandparents moved the corporate business and their home from Frankfurt to Berlin, and then became well-to-do members of a thriving Jewish community in Berlin. My grandparents had a large house on a tree-lined street with beautiful furniture, fine art, household help, a maid and a chauffeur. They attended the opera in Berlin and the symphony. And sometimes they attended the synagogue, but they always had a tree during Christmas time for the household help. Yes, my parents were upper middle class. My grandparents were upper middle class German Jews in Berlin. First German and then Jewish. And then the world began to change. There was always anti-Semitism in Germany. But when Hitler assumed the role of chancellor in January of 1933, events progressed very quickly to provoke fear in the lives of my grandparents. To commemorate Hitler's rise to power, there was a Nazi torchlight parade in Berlin, not far from my grandparents' home. And my grandmother Ida often told me that in fact she used to hear Hitler and Goebbels speak, and she would see SA Nazi paramilitary units marching down Berlin's main streets, the buildings of which were decorated with swastikas. In February 1933, Jews began to be assaulted on the streets of Berlin just because they looked Jewish. That same month, neighbors would start calling the police, saying that their Jewish neighbors, that there was something suspicious going on in their homes. The police would come and drag the Jewish families out of their homes and typically throw the husband or wife into one of Berlin's notorious prisons. In March 1933, the Dachau concentration camp opened for opponents of the Nazi regime. And then in April, there was a Nazi boycott of Jewish stores and businesses throughout Germany, directly affecting my grandfather's business in Berlin. And then in May, the Nazis staged book burnings throughout Germany, as well as in Berlin and other large cities. And it was perhaps then, ladies and gentlemen, that my grandparents remembered the words of Heinrich Heine, the German philosopher, who said 100 years earlier, where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people. So, within 6 months of Hitler's rise to power, my grandparents, Ida and Hermann Bensinger, became second-class citizens. They were afraid to venture outside. They could no longer conduct their lives as they used to. No operas, no symphonies. So fearful for their safety, by October 1933, my grandparents made the most fateful decision of their lives. They decided to leave Germany. They abandoned their beautiful home on the tree-lined street. They packed some furniture and belongings, but sold the art and many other fine goods for a fraction on the mark, for pennies on the mark. They said goodbye to family and friends and to their household help. And they moved to Palestine. They moved to a cinder block house in the sand dunes outside of Tel Aviv. Can you imagine? And even before my grandparents moved from Berlin, they asked that my father move to Amsterdam in 1932, thinking that perhaps he could make a life for himself there. In a moment, we'll see that Amsterdam did not become my father's place of refuge. Let's now take a look at the second reason that individuals leave their home, their place of birth or residence, and that is vilification, humiliation, names being called, perhaps bullying. And let me introduce you to my mother, Rachel, who was born in the town of Fulda in 1912. Fulda today is still a lovely town with homes hundreds of years old, a fine Baroque center. Fulda is a very religious town. It's the seat of the bishop. There's a strong Protestant population. And in fact, my mother attended a Protestant school in Fulda. Her mother, Tekla, was a homemaker. Her father, Willy, a salesman of agricultural equipment. My mother used to tell me that her parents were lower middle class citizens of Fulda, a secular family. Indeed, she said that her father, Willy, never attended synagogue. He would much rather play cards with his Christian friends in the local cafe. We'll see in a moment how useful those relationships proved to be. My mother had a happy childhood. She had Jewish friends and Christian friends until about the late 1920s when she was 16. Some of her friends started to call her names because of her wavy, curly hair. And then the name calling got worse and worse. They called her a Jewess. Feeling ridiculed, humiliated, and stigmatized for who she was, my mother Rachel felt she had no future in Germany. In Fulda, she joined a Jewish youth group, Blau-Weiß, blue-white, which later, as you know, would be the flag, the colors of the flag of the state of Israel. The young people would sing Hebrew songs together, and they would read authors like Herzl. And in fact, my mother became a firm believer in the political movement called Zionism. She felt that all German Jews should immigrate to Palestine and fight for the establishment of a state for the Jewish people. And she was determined to do just that. She often told me that her parents thought that she was crazy. Her father said, "What are you going to do in the land of sand?" He said, "Hitler is a political phenomenon. This is all going to blow over. We are Germans. Your future is in Germany," my grandfather said to my mother. But my mother knew better. She boarded a boat and sailed to Palestine. And on board the boat, she met my father, who was returning to Palestine after a short stay in Cyprus. In fact, he had immigrated to Palestine in 1934, joining his parents, Ida and Herman, realizing that Amsterdam would not be the refuge he thought it would be. My parents married in Tel Aviv in 1936 and started a textile business in Tel Aviv together with my father's parents, Ida and Herman, who, as you recall, emigrated from Germany to Palestine in October 1933. But in Europe in 1937 and 1938, storm clouds were building. For Jews, it was getting from bad to worse. My mother wrote to her parents in Fulda, "Now is the time to leave." Once again, her father Willy said, "I am a German. This is going to blow over. I fought in World War I. We are not leaving." And then, ladies and gentlemen, came Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, where mobs rampaged through small villages, towns, and large cities throughout Germany and Austria. 7,000 windows of Jewish businesses were smashed. The Nazis burned 250 synagogues. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested in their homes and sent to concentration camps. The Nazis came knocking on the home of my grandparents, Tekla and Willy, seeking to arrest Willy on Kristallnacht, but they were not home. They had escaped Germany about a week earlier, and perhaps Willy received word from some of his Christian friends with whom he played cards that there was something brewing and that it was time to leave. And that then, ladies and gentlemen, is the third reason or motivating factor to stay or to leave one's home: necessity. But my father's cousin, Edward Bensinger, back in that ancestral hometown Bodersweier in southern Germany with those 16 children, cousin Edward was not so fortunate. He was home when the Nazis came knocking on Kristallnacht. A neighbor stood outside watching, and after the war recounted to a historian what he had seen. By the way, here's a picture of my grandparents, Willy and Tekla. After they left Fulda, they settled in Tel-Aviv, and here's a beautiful picture of them. So back to Bodersweier. The SS entered the house of Edward and Elsa Bensinger. He tried to resist being taken, but was carried out of the house by the collar of his shirt. His wife Elsa held on to him and yelled that he should not be taken away. She was brutally separated from her husband by the SS officers and was thrown violently onto the floor. Edward, along with the other Jewish men of Bodersweier, were deported to the Dachau concentration camp. On the way there on the train, they were brutally abused, and for many that abuse continued while they were at Dachau. After some time, Edward returned to Bodersweier as a broken man. And though Edward was released from Dachau, on October 22nd, 1940, Edward, his wife Elsa, their son Julius, 26 other members of the Bensinger family, and some 6,000 other Jews from Baden were deported by the Nazis to southern France to an internment camp by the name of Gurs. Gurs lay at the foothills of the Pyrenees Mountains. Gurs was not a death camp. There was no gas chamber in Gurs, but people died of the cold, the illness, and the starvation. And those that did not die at Gurs were ultimately deported to Auschwitz. Edward decided that he would take matters in his own hands. Having experienced Dachau, Edward reached his decision. He committed suicide, leaving his wife Elsa and son Julius. Edward left a note. "They will never catch me a second time," he said. Elsa and Julius were deported to Auschwitz, Elsa to be murdered immediately upon arrival, and Julius died after liberation from starvation and malnutrition. Another cousin of my father on the Bensinger side, Martha Bodenheimer, was also deported to Gurs with her immediate family. But her sister was not deported because her sister was married to a Christian back in Bodersweier. From Gurs, Martha sent a letter to her sister. "Please send us a package, food, clothing, as quickly as possible. Maybe the day will come where we will see each other again. Mama and I are so homesick. But it was not to be. Martha's grandmother, Fanny Bensinger, died in Gurs at the age of 84, one of the oldest to have been deported. Her mother, Augusta Bensinger Meyer, died at the age of 59. Martha survived the hardship of Gurs, the starvation, the cold, the illness, only to be deported at the age of 32. On September 7th, 1942, on transport number 29 to Auschwitz, to be immediately sent to the gas chambers. Though it became necessary to leave Germany, whether to leave or to stay was a difficult decision. We saw from my mother, because she was a Zionist, she wanted to go to Palestine. But sandy Palestine was not an option for every German. And for many, they did not have the financial means to leave Germany. The Nazis imposed steep exit taxes, and travel from Germany to the United States or to South America was very expensive. So the decision to stay or to go was made for them, assuming even that they had an entry visa into another country. Because as you well know, most of the world slammed their doors to the Jews. And then others would not leave aged parents or grandparents. And that was the case with my grandmother Tekla's brother, Hugo Sichel, back in Fulda. Hugo was a tailor for his father in his father's clothing store. And when his father became ill in the 1930s, in the mid-30s, Hugo decided to take care of his father rather than taking advantage of the affidavit of support that Hugo's brother Joe, who was already in America, had lodged with the US consul in Germany. After his father's death, it was too late for Hugo to leave Fulda, and he was deported on December 8th, 1941. And on the screen, ladies and gentlemen, you'll see the list of the Jews deported that day from Fulda, and Hugo's name is yellow highlighted. Fulda's Jewish community was advised 2 weeks prior thereto of their upcoming deportation. They were given notice that able-bodied individuals under the age of 65 were to be evacuated. They were told to pack a small suitcase or a sack, put some personal belongings in there, some clothes, a blanket, eating utensils, and enough food for a train ride of 5 or 6 days. December 8th, 1941 was cold and snowy. And this is one of the 3 surviving pictures of the Jews at the train station in Fulda. The Jews of Fulda were made to march down the town's main street, Bahnhofstraße, to the train station, where they were put on trains and sent to a town by the name of Kassel, some 1 hour's ride away. Kassel was a gathering point for trains from throughout the region. And in Kassel, A train was loaded with 1,000 Jews, those from Fulda and others, and it made its way to Riga. Upon arrival in Riga, hundreds of Jews were slaughtered. Those that were able-bodied were sent on work details. We don't know the date of death or place or circumstances of Hugo's death. But ladies and gentlemen, what we do know are the names and the dates of the individuals who back in Fulda bought at auction Hugo Sichel's furniture, his clothing, and his personal belongings. And this was not an unusual situation throughout Germany. In many towns, the items of those who were deported were purchased at auction by the non-Jewish citizens of those towns. We saw, ladies and gentlemen, that Hugo chose not to leave Germany because he was caring for his father. But some people couldn't leave because they themselves were ill or handicapped. And that was the case of my grandfather Herman's sister Elsa back in Bordersweiler. You remember my grandfather had 15 siblings and Elsa was one of them. But Elsa was either mentally retarded, but had a mental condition. We don't know exactly what it was, but we do know from the records that in later life, she was institutionalized. Pursuant to the Nazi policy of euthanasia, were all Germans, if they had a physical or mental defect, be they Jewish or non-Jewish, were to be euthanized. Elsa was picked up at her institution along with the other patients in a gray bus with blacked out windows. And it traveled to a castle in southern Germany, a beautiful castle as you can see from the photo, but one with a sinister past. Because on the grounds of the castle, the Nazis had built a shed, and inside the shed was a prototype gas chamber, similar to be used in Auschwitz just a year or so later. Elsa and the other patients were led from the gray bus to the shed, being told that they would be taking a shower. They were gassed and their bodies cremated at Grafeneck Castle. Elsa wasn't given an opportunity to leave Germany or to stay. Though Israel became a refuge for my parents, my grandparents, and many, many other German Jews, nevertheless, the Nazis were at the doorstep of the Jewish community in Palestine. Nazi armored divisions were rolling through North Africa, making their way to Palestine. And in fact, the Italians who were aligned with the Germans bombed Tel Aviv. But in time, World War II ended. But the struggle for statehood for the Jewish people continued in Palestine, and my parents participated in that struggle. But on May 14th, 1948, the state of Israel was declared as a sovereign state. I was born the following year in 1949, joining my brother Gad, who had been born 11 years earlier in Tel Aviv. But in 1959, my parents made the decision to leave Israel for America, where my father had been offered a job. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the fourth reason or motivating factor to stay or to leave one's home: economic opportunity. We first settled in New York City in Washington Heights, known as Frankfurt on the Hudson, because there were so many German Jewish emigres living there. But by several years later, we moved to Chicago. And here are my grandmother, my father, and my mother on the shores of Lake Michigan. My father died 10 years later. And then my mother became an occupational therapist, working with the elderly at nursing homes in Chicago, as well as the self-help home for the aged, which after the war became a refuge for Holocaust survivors. I grew up in Chicago, went to school there, practiced law for some 30 years, immigration law. And after my retirement from law, I created a documentary to preserve the history of the Central European Jewish community before, during, and after the Holocaust. I interviewed survivors at the self-help home for that documentary. And upon her retirement, my mother moved into the self-help home, where she resided shortly before her own passing at the age of 102. And here is a picture, a family picture of us celebrating my mother's 101st birthday. And in it is my wife, Elizabeth, two of my two daughters, Jennifer and Karen holding the first of 4 grandchildren on her lap. So, ladies and gentlemen, my parents and grandparents were faced with the most important decision of their lives: to stay or to leave Germany. But leaving, of course, saved their lives and permitted the family to grow and to prosper in Israel as well as in the United States. And today we discussed the motivating factors that led my families to leave Germany. But we also learned that when it became necessary to do so, for many family members, it was impossible to leave Germany. And in fact, more than 40 members of our family were murdered in the Holocaust. But now, let me tell you the rest of the story. Exactly 2 years ago, I was invited to travel to Fulda to screen my film Refuge and to give this very presentation to students at schools in Fulda. After the screening, a newspaper reporter came up to me and wanted to know a little about our family history in Fulda. I told him about Hugo and the fact that he cared for his father and was deported to Riga. The following day, an elderly lady by the name of Heidi Schuhai opened the newspaper in her home, read the article, and recognized the name Hugo Sichel. She contacted the organizers of the screening and who put me then in contact with Mrs. Schuhai. By then I was back in Deerfield. We spoke in German by telephone, and Mrs. Schuhai told me a story that her father, Paul, was best friends with Hugo Sichel, and that prior to Hugo's deportation, Hugo had given her father a blue and white tablecloth. Her father decided never to use the tablecloth to keep it neatly folded, to treat it with great reverence. And prior to his own passing in 1976, he gave the tablecloth to his daughter, Heidi Shuhai. During the phone conversation, Mrs. Shuhai asked if we'd like to have the tablecloth returned to the family. I, of course, said yes. After the phone call, I discussed with my wife Elizabeth and daughters Karen and Jennifer whether we should fly to Fulda to pick it up. And in fact, we did so. We flew to Fulda to say thank you to Mrs. Shuhai and to bring the tablecloth back home. Mrs. Shuhai treated us very graciously in her home. She served us Kaffee und Kuchen, coffee and cake. And afterwards, she got up from the table, went over to the cupboard, and took out the neatly folded tablecloth, which now, 80 years later, is at our home in Deerfield. It is the only connection that we have to my grandmother's brother, Hugo Sichel, who was murdered in the Holocaust. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention, for tuning in. And I have a commercial announcement now from the museum. Join us here next Wednesday, March 3rd at 10 a.m. Central Time to hear second-generation speaker Carol Letofsky share her mother's story of survival. Please keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook page and other social media accounts, where we will post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times. And I'll now be more than happy to answer any questions that you have that you'll probably be putting into the chat box. Thanks kindly.
Thank you, Ethan. We do have a couple of questions.
Great, see you. Hi.
Great presentation. Many people said it's wonderful and beautiful, so yay for that. The first question is, how did you find all these records, and what was the process? What were the steps of kind of filling in this really detailed history that you have?
Well, as I mentioned, the first records that I really found were when I was a much younger man in the 1970s, when I went to Borders Wire to the town. And there I was introduced to the parish priest, who said that the local church in Borders Wire has deed books. And these huge deed books in the basement of the church had records not only of Christian births and deaths, but as well of Jewish births, marriages, deaths, Brits. So much of what I was able to find was already there. And we made photographs of these deed book pages. I took those photographs back to Chicago, and thankfully my Oma Ida, who of course spoke German fluently and could read that old German script, translated it for me. And so out of those deed books, we were able to formulate the first Bensinger family tree. With respect to the other side of the family in Fulda, I've had the wonderful help of a local historian there by the name of Anja Listman, who has been able to dig through the archives in Fulda to find a lot of the information that I presented in the slides regarding Hugo Sichel. And of course, I had family photographs in shoeboxes, as so many individuals perhaps have in their own homes today as well.
That's amazing. When did your family first start sharing their story with you?
As is, I think, typical for many families of survivors and refugees, my mother finally felt I was old enough after I had reached the age of 50 to let me know the true stories of who lived, who died, who was able to make it to Palestine and to other parts of the world. So not unusual at all that individuals kept that information to themselves. And that is what I learned as well when I filmed the documentary at the self-help home interviewing survivors. When we screened the film for the first time, and by the way, it premiered at the Illinois Holocaust Museum in 2012, and there were family members there. And some of the children of these survivors came up to me and said, "This is the first time I've heard these stories. My mother or grandmother never shared these stories with me." So not unusual at all. And that was the case in my family as well.
What was it like growing up as a child of survivors?
You know, I was fortunate, of course, in that my parents weren't in a camp. They had left Germany before Hitler, after Hitler's rise, but of course, truly before the Holocaust. Um, so the subject of the loss of family members, as I mentioned a moment ago, was truly not discussed. Rather, what was important at our home was Israel, and the fact that Israel served early on during the time my parents went to Israel, during the years that they fought and struggled for its creation, and thereafter, the topic was typically the survival and continued survival of Israel through all the wars, the Sinai, the 67, the 73.
You mentioned that you've been to Germany and Europe. Did your family ever go back?
My mother indeed did go back to Germany. I started going back for business as an attorney in the 70s and in the 80s. And then starting with my film, I started to screen the film right after 2012. I made some contacts at schools in Frankfurt, in Berlin, in other towns, and have been going annually back for a period of 3 to 4 years every year with my film, together with the presentation that we heard today. I speak German, so I've had the good fortune of really being able to do Q&As with students in German, as well as in English, because many German students do speak English. But yes, I do go back frequently to Germany. Thank you.
Yeah. And then when and why did you get involved with the museum?
I got involved with Lillian as I was doing research on my film. And I remember going to the storefront on Main Street, and Lillian Gersner would help me go through some of the museum's archives. I collected black and white footage, documentation for the documentary that I was building. And so my relationship with the museum was really early on in those years already. And it continued, as I said, with the premiere of the film at the museum, and then the good fortune of being the second generation speaker for the last over 5 years.
Great. One last question that I have. What kind of message or takeaway do you want people to have from hearing your family's story?
Well, the fact that we really can't forget these stories, because as we know from recent events, history can repeat itself. And it's critical for young people truly to understand what occurred in the past and what that early bullying, name calling that my mother endured, what that led up to in Germany in the 30s and 40s. So what can start with a name can build into something much more than that. And I think that's an important message, that we have to always be on our guard.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. I will let you say goodbye real quick. One last time.
Good. Thank you, everybody, for your attention, and see you at the museum. And thanks for being with us today. All the best to all of you. Bye-bye now.